Hello, I'm Matthias Martins. Welcome back to my reading of my book, How to Do Things with Stories. We are on to Chapter 8, When to Make Sense. In the last chapter, we closed by talking about the role of ideal worlds in fiction. Fiction may release the constraints of the world we know, allowing us to explore the world as it could be. But if this world is unconstrained in the extreme, the reader will find it hollow and will fail to see in it a reflection of his own life. The necessity of constraints in storytelling is an important point. It is worth approaching it from another angle. In this chapter, the question we will ask is, when the writer plots her story, how closely should she follow rules? Be they the rules of the real world, the rules of her genre, or the rules she herself has previously established in the story? On the face of it, the answer is simple. She should always follow the rules. A story that violates logic is flawed. But we have to consider the numerous, enormously popular and influential stories where, in service of creating a satisfying moment, the narrative obstacles to that moment were simply swept away. A better answer from the premise of this book is this. A story should follow its own rules, yes, for without rules the reader has nothing to build his expectations on. But above all, the writer must keep the reader immersed. It may be justified for her to employ a little sleight of hand in service of this goal, distracting the reader with action up front while concealing a plot hole in the shadows. But in doing this, she is always at a disadvantage. She is in danger of the reader liking her story too much, and thus noticing the plot hole, perhaps feeling betrayed by it, feeling that the story can no longer resonate in that deep way that makes it a guide to his soul. It is down to the expectations of the reader, and perhaps the genre, what kinds of inconsistency will raise these concerns. But a rule may be broken in another way, with a sledgehammer. This is done in full view of the reader, without apology. Frogs fall from the sky. The dead are reborn. The immortal one is slain. It is all to produce an outcome the reader could not have predicted from what he was already told. In this case, the shock itself is what creates the effect. Yes, a sledgehammer can be an effective tool, indeed. In what narrative scenario is this a reasonable move for the storyteller to consider? To answer that, we need to recognize that rule following and rule breaking do not exist in a binary. Instead, there is a spectrum, with rule bending in between. Just like it is possible to chart a story's tension wave, so is it possible to chart a story's path on this spectrum. First, let's establish what stories exist on the extremes. As an example of a story that is very faithfully chained to its own rules, let us consider The Martian. In this story, an astronaut becomes stranded on Mars in a great dust storm. Using the faulty equipment available to him, he must fashion tools to get what he needs to survive: water, shelter, food, air. And he must find a way to signal his rescuers and ultimately free himself from the planet. This is a case where the reader naturally expects the story to proceed according to its own logic, and indeed according to the logic of the real world. If The Martian cheats the real world, it undermines its premise, and arguably its sole reason for being, which is to show how a real person could plausibly survive in that situation. At the other extreme, let us consider Alice in Wonderland. To say that Alice breaks its own rules is misleading. There simply are no rules to begin with. What puts Alice on the rule-breaking extreme is the breakneck speed with which apparent rules are taken away. In one instant, we have a cat's grin without a cat. In another, we have fully embodied people and animals stuck at 6 o'clock for attempting to murder the time. With this in mind, let us be more precise about the extremes we're talking about. They are not simply about rule following or rule breaking, but about proceeding critically versus proceeding by intuition. On one extreme, the writer is planning steps like an engineer, checking each new story development for consistency with what has already been shown, said, or implied. On the other, she is led by her own meandering train of thought. This does not necessarily make the story ineffective, provided that the path she follows is a path the reader can follow with her. In the case of Alice, after all, we are led on a tour of all the total nonsense that can nevertheless be expressed in a grammatically correct way, with the deeper goal, it's suggested, of satirizing mathematics. A reader can accept this and follow along without needing the usual trappings of a plot. Both Alice and The Martian are effective books with respect to what their writers apparently intended. It's worthwhile to ask, though, how does a story's place on the critical intuitive spectrum shape its effects on the reader? Books like The Martian fall into the category of hard science fiction, the side of science fiction that is most focused on plausibility. These are very critically written. They often have the effect on readers of encouraging them to consider what the future might be like, and convincing them that certain human futures are likely, or at least plausible. They may move the reader emotionally, but the emotional effect is very tightly tied up with the intellectual effect. The trials of the characters in the story exist primarily as lenses into the possibilities of our own world. On the critical side, we can also think of realistic fiction that tries to portray a clear-eyed view of society, like David Simon's TV series The Wire, or even fantasy fiction that's committed to modeling realistic politics and sociology, like George R.R. Martin's book series A Song of Ice and Fire. In these cases, expectations are sometimes frustrated in a way that feels very real, and the emotional resonance is heightened by the familiarity to us of what the characters must face: moral ambiguity, random death, and the remoteness of a tidy resolution to anything. Critical storytelling engages the mind without necessarily neglecting the heart. At its best, it encourages us to follow the story with our whole waking selves, just as if we were trying to navigate its challenges with the same sense of hazard as the characters. By contrast, intuitive storytelling encourages a dreamlike state. It is the mode of parables and fables. It also engages the mind, but in a holistic way. We see the world all in one piece, with all its strangeness. This makes intuitive storytelling, in a sense, more personal. It's describing pure experience, without care for secondary judgments like where, when, why, and how. Distinctions that seem important melt away, enabling strange and unexpected connections. The effect of intuitive storytelling is thus much harder to quantify than that of critical storytelling. For the same reason, intuitive storytelling has the power to be especially potent, tapping into our core drives in a more direct way. Earlier, we alluded to the idea that a story can be broken with a sledgehammer, that the apparent rules can be unraveled in an instant. On a chart, this would appear as a flat line of critical storytelling erupting suddenly into a spike of intuition. What effect can this achieve? To me, the standout example of such storytelling is 2001: A Space Odyssey, especially Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation. By its premise, we know the story is about human progress and humanity's future among the stars. But much of its runtime is devoted to a journey through space that is mind-numbingly slow and tedious. The expedition is almost doomed when Hal, the ship AI, attempts to murder the crew. While this is not tedious, it raises a dispiriting point by reminding us of the potential of human technology to go perversely out of human control. Hal kills one crewman, before the final crewman, David Bowman, deactivates him, at which point Bowman is utterly alone in the blackness of space. This is when he reaches the obelisk, triggering the famous visual sequence that closes the film. This sequence is often compared to a drug trip, full of vivid hallucinations. Indeed, one could read it as the disintegration of Bowman's psyche in response to the extreme stress he is under. But the film presents it to us as real. Put another way, the audience does not merely witness Bowman's hallucination, but actively joins him in it. Through this sequence, Bowman perceives his own mortality, and then transcends it, transcends all human limitation, is reborn. The main part of the film paints a bleak picture of humanity and its place in the stars. The research team's group photo on the moon suggests our arrogance. The journey through space shows the scale of our solitude. Hal's betrayal shows the limits of our tools. The final sequence is a cataclysmic shock to all this. It serves both as an expression of hope, that there might be something out there that can show us the way, and as a call to inner transformation, a message that for humanity to take its place in the stars, it will be necessary for us to transform in a way that is no less extreme than the effect the obelisk had on Bowman. As a counterpoint to the optimism of that story, we can, as always, turn to Kafka. Just as the Metamorphosis follows the declining peak story structure with regard to narrative tension, it follows a path along the critical intuitive spectrum that, compared to 2001, is similarly reversed. At the very beginning of that story, Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect is the exact reverse of everything we would expect based on what follows. The story is set in a mundane world. No one else, it appears, spontaneously transforms into insects. Everyone, even Gregor the insect himself, is concerned with mundane things like finances, manners, and climbing in social rank. Even so, the world does not respond to Gregor's absurd transformation with the shock and wonder one might reasonably expect. It is merely an inconvenience they must live with. Kafka's use of this device allows him to cut straight to the heart of what his story is really about. The Metamorphosis is a harrowingly intimate self-portrait of Kafka as a fantasist, stricken with the desire to write, to spend hours in quiet reflection, and to think deeply about impractical concerns, all things that make him condemnable and detestable in the eyes of his authorities. And, of course, Kafka, projected into his story, sees things exclusively from the perspective of those authorities. He, too, hates what he has become, hates that he cannot fulfill the demands of his life that up to this point he considered entirely reasonable. The story seems, therefore, to split Kafka as Gregor into two parts: his mind, which sympathizes with his father and his boss, and his raw being, which is of some other nature, incapable of conforming, and therefore wretched. We can see the genius of Metamorphosis in how Kafka juggles the language of fable and the language of reality. Without the device of the insect, it is hard to imagine a portrayal of the artist's remorse and self-torment that is anywhere near as moving, or told with anywhere near its economy of storytelling. Let's consider one further example: Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein is frequently cited as an early example of, or even the first instance of, science fiction. It is, after all, thematically focused on the implications of scientific achievement. But while it does qualify as science fiction in this way, it does not straightforwardly belong on the critical end of the storytelling spectrum. For one thing, Victor Frankenstein's path to the reanimation of dead tissue is not entirely a scientific one. He first studies the alchemists, and only later studies chemistry and physics. He achieves his result by combining the alchemists' magical worldview and their beliefs about what is possible, with the precision and rigor of a contemporary scientist. Hence, from the beginning, we're led to the view that Frankenstein's creation has an aspect of the mystical, that he represents not just the hubris of science over nature, but also the hubris of the occult man, the seeker of secrets, over God. The supernatural strain of the story carries through into the monster himself. He seems to have superhuman endurance, speed, and strength. Despite the need to avoid human contact, he covers great distances with ease. Indeed, at times he can be read as a psychological projection of Victor Frankenstein, shadowing him like a guilty conscience. This is helped by Victor Frankenstein's seemingly pathological unwillingness to tell any of his loved ones what he has done, as if he sees the monster as a hallucination that haunts him alone, even though the story as a whole makes it very clear that the monster is real. Supernatural does not necessarily mean intuitive. Stories with supernatural elements can still be plotted critically. But the psychological aspect, where the monster acts like a projection of Victor's conscience and his worst fears about himself, is a hallmark of an intuitive style of storytelling. Hence, Frankenstein weaves between critical and intuitive modes. Interestingly, some of the most critical plotting and the most reasoned narration comes not from Victor Frankenstein, but from his monster. The effect of this is comparable to what we saw in Metamorphosis. The intuitive approach to the monster's ability, his behavior, and the process of his creation allows Shelley to hone in on what she wants her story to explore, while the critical approach to life outside the experiment and the monster's own inner monologue anchors the horror in mundane life and connects it to its real-world message. One does not need to balance critical and intuitive storytelling modes, or actively weave between them, in order to tell an effective story. Most writers find that they have a preferred place along the spectrum, and one may find that changing that place is as difficult as developing a taste for a kind of food one despises. Nevertheless, understanding this spectrum helps a writer understand how she can best tell stories, as well as offering some clues about what types of effect she can best aim for, and the opportunity to take a narrative sledgehammer to one's story is an option available to everyone. I've been Matthias Martins. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of How to Do Things with Stories. Stay tuned for Chapter 9, Style.